Mom, how did Dad become interested in strengthening the Japanese American community?
Well, I think it probably started when he was growing up, because his father, being a Methodist minister, he and his mother served the Japanese Methodist churches and went from place to place, and that was sort of a lifelong job. But I think after that, having moved from place to place, having traveled abroad, having moved out of the Japanese American community, we became more aware of what we were missing, that we had taken for granted in California. And I think that's much of what I'm seeing with you in Stanford, since you're in Boston and Stanford is in Washington. And sometimes we don't see those things when they're so close.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
What was Dad's role in the early days of the Japanese Cultural Center, as it was called then? What was his contribution, and what were his major concerns, and why?
Well, I think probably he was concerned with once his parents got ill and they're elderly, he was beginning to see the need for what the elderly needed, and elder care, nutrition, and there wasn't that set up. I think it was hard because he got together a group of people that he thought would be supportive of that idea, and he found a small group of active people that were like-minded, and they met from let's see, when would that be?
1971 or so?
Yeah, probably about that. And they talked about what could be done to build up the community, and how they could go about, putting this into action.
Yeah. And what was Dad doing professionally at that time?
Well, he was hired as a staff planner, and particularly to get funding and monies for the city and county of Sacramento.
Yeah.
So, by profession, he was a planner. And so he saw things in terms of needs down the road.
Yeah, and the name of the agency?
Oh, this was the Sacramento Redevelopment and Housing Authority.
Yeah.
Right.
When was the year that he started working for them?
Oh, that was in, let's see, 68.
69?
Yeah, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was after Stanford was born, and we moved back to California. When we were in Ohio, he had seen how the JA family that we had met had lost their identity. They weren't considering themselves Japanese Americans. They were, from the Midwest, and he knew that he had to come back to do that. And so that was in the back of his mind all that time.
Yeah, well, that was pretty brave of you and Dad to pack up bags and...
Oh, we came without a job.
Without a job, just to come back to California and have faith that you would get a job.
Well,
not you, but Dad would get a job.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, my parents were saying, you better get a job. What if something happens? But he wasn't concerned. He knew that there was something that he needed to do down the road, and he was looking for the right thing to come along.
And the redevelopment work was pretty new at that time.
Yes, I think one disadvantage he had was before he had come, there was a J-town in that area that they were redeveloping, and so the redevelopment agency had sort of a reputation of having uprooted the Japanese Americans, and this was for the second time after the war. And so, of course, a lot of the Japanese Americans didn't trust the redevelopment agency, so his connection there probably was, an obstruction or
Yeah.
something he had to overcome.
Yeah, there's some recent scholarship. I just looked up the time frame of that, and it was that they were redevelopment agency had a role in removing or destroying Japantown
Right.
in the late 1950s. So by 1961, people were all
Yeah.
moved out.
Right.
So that's
And
about
of course
10
they were
years.
angry probably
Yeah.
about that.
That's not that long between the closure of the Japantown, people moving out, and then this project of the Japanese Cultural Center.
Right. So I think that definitely affected the attitudes of many of the Japanese Americans towards him. They didn't see him as working for them, but
Not at first, at least.
yeah, right. As they just thought of his connection.
So, how do you think his career equipped him to be a leader of the JCC in these early years?
Well, I think he's always been a visionary, and he had a way of pushing from behind without beating his own drum, and he encouraged people to use their strengths and talents to, work towards something if they work together.
Yeah. Do you remember any of the challenges or opportunities that Dad faced in leading the JCC as they were trying to get this off the ground?
Well, first of all, the distrust of the Japanese Americans, and that was understandable. But at that time, I didn't know the history of J-Town, but also the rest of the Asian community were not accepting of working with this idea and being a part of it. And people don't look down the road that far. We don't see 20, 30, 40, 50 years in advance, and that's the job of a planner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, Naomi, it's interesting. I went to that very first meeting. I had a 3-year-old child. Wendy was 3 years old, and I read this article about how this meeting was being called, and I thought, wow, that sounds really interesting. And I went to it, and it was amazing. There was a representation, all these different realtors and church people and Kenjinkai people. They were all there, and Leo was quietly there orchestrating this thing, I guess, but I didn't get that feeling that there was any feeling of animosity towards the redevelopment, because really that redevelopment had been around maybe during the 60s, the early 60s, so it really hadn't been that long. But
Right.
I didn't sense any of that, and I want to tell you that it was not, it didn't follow the fears that you might have had
Right.
or concerns, but it wasn't that. We were all gung-ho. We thought, oh, this is great. We're going to get housing for these older Issei,
Right.
around Southside Park. And that
Right.
was really exciting. Yeah.
It's not the kind of thing that you ask, as someone that was new to the community. So, it was only many years afterwards that I thought, I wonder how much bad feeling there were.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this week we've been talking a lot about Dad's work. I'm wondering if you had insights about the ways in which Dad's work parallels the work of Stan and me as his kids.
I think it had a great influence because you're both doing work that involves the community and promotes, togetherness. Stanford as an education theorist at Bellingham, Washington, Western Washington University, is now working with John Kempo Cultural Center, the group, as president, and he's trying to help us with the development of that group, and Courtney, as you as theologist at Boston University, you're working with you know what you're doing.
Yeah.
You're working with the Northeastern Japanese American community and doing work there with them. So I think a lot of that was Dad's influence on you.
It was amazing to learn this week more about his work.
Right.
Yeah, so thanks for inviting us to do this, because I was just home on vacation, and it was like, oh, I didn't realize I was going to have to do all this research and to.
Well, thank you for being so willing to take part in this.
I learned a lot about my dad, and it was so. In learning about who he was so young when this happened. He was 36, 37, 38 years old when, in the early days of the JCC, and in the very first time it was referred to as the Japanese Cultural Association until it became Japanese Community Center.
Is that right? I didn't even
JCC,
I didn't
Japanese
even
Cultural
realize that.
Center, and then became Japanese Community Center. So I want to show you folks some of what I found. And I want to say first of all that, and you probably already know this from your multiple interviews of people, that everyone has these different versions of what happened, and it's a kind of mystery, a jigsaw puzzle of trying to figure out, from different perspectives, what really happened. And so, this is sort of obviously our take, or my take on this history, not having had a chance to ask my dad about these things, and now I wish I had. But I was 2 years old when he was doing this work, and I would have different questions now than I would have if I had, just knowing about this as a kid or even as a teenager. So there's a lot of materials here, and so I think that Dad didn't anticipate this for archival purposes. I think he clipped these out at times for his own souvenirs, because some of these things don't have dates. I think this is an important piece. It's called A Proposal for Japanese. And at first I thought it was when the JCC had already done its feasibility study and they were proposing the center. But as I read this more closely, those announcements actually come later, and I'll show you those pieces. I think this was published before. It's written by Korean American journalist K.W. Lee, who was a journalist for the Sacramento Union. And I think that this might have been he might have interviewed my dad when he was doing this series called The Saga of Some Americans. And so he was profiling kind of Dad as one of this series. And this was on his mind, and it talks about what he had in mind for the JCC. And this drawing is by Alan Oshima.
Alan did draw up plans, yeah.
Yeah, did you see this? Was this presented at the meeting?
It was, I don't remember it being presented at the meetings.
Yeah.
I thought later Alan came up with these designs,
Okay, so it's possible that either this interview was done before the proposal and this is what he had in mind, or it's possible this really could have come after it was proposed.
Yeah.
But someone would have to go through the archives, the Sacramento Union archives,
to see
to try to eyeball when exactly this article was published. But what I found really interesting was that Dad talks about, the rationale about, quote, it is about time Sacramento's Japanese Americans start thinking about the renewing of their own heritage for the coming generations. And he talks about different models of cultural centers. And that in the late 60s and 67, presumably on his way back from Ohio, moving with Mom, they stopped in Toronto, and he was really impressed by the Japanese Cultural Center in Toronto as like a possible like way of thinking about it.
We made a trip up there just for that.
Oh, you did?
Right.
Oh, interesting.
Right.
So you were living in Ohio, and you
Right.
made this trip up to Toronto.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So it was much earlier.
Yeah. Okay, so he was just interested in Japanese cultural centers. And in this article, he contrasts, for example, how San Francisco Nihonmachi is less of a good model because it was mainly centered on the commercial district, which he thought, so there's some interesting shops, but there's a lot of shops that sell things that you can get elsewhere. He wanted to see, he thought that other models like Denver and Toronto really had more of a better plan to interweave and make the cultural programs, the history, the youth, the elderly, all integrated in one center.
Wow.
So it was very interesting to learn about like what were some of the influences in his thinking.
Yeah.
And I assume that he might have presented these ideas at that first meeting or to other folks who wanted to possibly give money to this, and that Al Onoshima's drawing might have helped people imagine what this could look like.
You know, I don't remember Ellen's drawings at that time, but I think he must have incorporated some of the things your dad wanted to do, because I kind of remember there was going to be the housing portion of it, but I thought around it there would be businesses, you know.
Yes. No, the article talks about the vision of having, special meeting rooms, craft rooms, library, apartments, restaurant, maybe special areas for the garden. And so what made me wonder was if this was an early vision, was there were things that weren't recommended or reported on, in at least in the articles that announced the proposal. So someone would have to check to see if this was before or after.
Yeah. And K.W. Lee is still living.
Is he?
Yeah, he lives in
I
Rancho
wonder.
Cordova, I think.
Oh, is that
so
right?
he must be pretty,
Right.
he's
He
way
was
older
older
than
than right.
I think. And so it'd be kind of interesting to see
What he remembers.
how he is mentally, to see
Yeah.
if we could even, interview him.
Right.
Yeah.
How interesting that would be.
He was a good friend of my sister's. And if anything, she should get
Yeah.
involved in trying to meet with him,
Right.
Because we had talked about that. We said, I wonder what he's doing now.
Mhm.
So, yeah. But that gives us something else to think about.
Another clue that made me wonder about the timing of this piece was that Dad says that wonders whether the JECL could, quote, act as a catalyst and organize a subcommittee to find out its feasibility of the center, which is sort of like, oh, it hadn't even been a thought of like the community bringing together its own ad hoc committee made up of constituents and stakeholders. He was originally thinking at this writing that it might be
Some of
a
the JCL.
pre-existing organization like JCL might take that up.
But that's the study that came out of the hiring of my sister.
Yes.
So it's kind of interesting. It all kind of makes sense now,
Yes.
Falling
Yeah,
into
yeah.
place.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so this article discusses the Cultural Center for Japanese is proposed, and just names some of the some players who were serving on various committees like Hachi Asamura, Greg, or this is Gerald Kajitani, or Alan Oshima's mentioned, Phil Hiroshima, Frank Iwama as attorneys, and just suggesting like all the stakeholders that.
And is there a date on this one?
This is
Oh, this one,
1972.
yeah. So that was, January. And
Yep.
we incorporated in about March or something, I think.
Yeah. And this is also when they're thinking about hiring a project director.
Okay.
Here's the announcement for them to find someone, which I assume is your sister Peggy
I
Syka,
think so.
right?
I think
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, so that
Eventually
that
ended.
follows along, and then this is where they the plans were revealed. This one is undated, but there are several here. This one is identical to that, so the B and the union accounts coincide on the same day, and so we probably already know what was in the report. This was announced December 6, 1972.
Oh, so yeah, that's at the end of that year then.
Yeah,
when we
my guess
incorporated,
my guess is that the study was actually released to the group earlier. They had
I don't know how long that study took.
8 months.
8 months?
Mhm.
So if we incorporated in March, that's,
Yeah, this writing refers to after 8 months of the feasibility study.
Okay.
And it refers to study director Peggy Syka here. Yeah.
I'm looking for this historian's book at ACC to see, and it would be interesting to see if we have, the same kinds of articles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was interesting, Dad is in this interview talking about about the importance of keeping the young people and the old people together, and that I think that becomes a theme of other projects in his professional life, of like foster grandparents, for example, that he was instrumental
Right.
in founding.
Well,
and-
certainly the Tanashimi Kai,
Yes.
that would fall into getting funding for the
Well, now
elderly.
when I think of it, how he was getting all these grants, because they say, well, we got a grant, and I never asked where did it come from or anything like
Yeah.
that. He must have gotten those grants.
Yes, I think so.
When we did, Tanishimi
Right.
Kai.
Right.
Right.
It's interesting. Yeah.
Right. Well, I know the Buddhist church one took off right away, but they had a hard time getting enough people for the
Methodist,
church one. And I remember him making me go to pick people up, and people didn't know me from anybody, so they were afraid to come on my car. But I know he and I both used to go on Tanashimi Kai Day to work. I think Emiko was there at that time.
Yeah, I can't remember how long we're going to talk to her so we could ask her
Right,
that. When did
right.
you start getting? But I remember Minnie Tanihara. She, people used to have to call to make the reservation. And at one time, ours used to go all the way to the end of the social hall. And then the next time I went, I said, wow, where did all the people go? It's gotten so small. They said, they all passed away. I said, oh, because that was part of what was happening.
Right.
But at one time, it did go all the way
Right.
back. It was pretty busy.
Right.
Okay, so I think we're now up to. So you probably remember that there was a federal housing moratorium.
Oh, yeah, I remember that's what
yeah. So
put a
there was-
kibosh on everything.
Yeah, it really. So this is an announcement, and there
About
need to be
that?
times about Sacramento Japanese community gives up center building plan.
And what's the date of that one?
This is dated March 1974.
74, yeah.
Yeah, so there are a couple small articles here that talk a little bit about his, the grants that that they got, and these are undated, but I suspect it refers to 74 and 75, where the city council gave them 15,000. The group was asking for 30,000. Shell Oil was
Oh, yeah,
giving
we
them
used
a
to get
grant.
those Shell Oil grants through Chewy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that now.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
right. He did have
Yeah.
a shell station.
Yep. Yeah, so I think those are the things that kind of kept the project going. And so, the grand plan from the original kind of scaled back to, what was doable and what
Well,
people
so
could
how
have.
fortunate it was that Secopoulos, took an interest and donated that
That was way
generous
later, though,
piece of
in the
land.
1980s that
Oh.
he gave that land.
He came on.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
This article has a reference to Peggy Syka as well as Dad. Let's see, this is Sacramento Union, December 1976. And both of them are interviewed here.
And Henry Takeda.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
And
look how young they look.
they do look young, right? And so I thought it was interesting, like Peggy is talking about, how the JCC also serves the needs of not only Japanese Americans. It reminded me, like in that very first piece that I showed, here's this piece. That very, very first piece that I showed had Dad talking about the fact that his vision, as he thought about, even if it would be called a JCC or a Japanese Cultural Center, that it would not just be for Japanese.
Well, see, because then that's the early history that I didn't used to understand. But there's that young group. I used to call them radicals and communists and this and that, But they just wanted equal treatment for everybody, and they were picketing. You were too young. Benvenuti, when he had that miniature golf place, he had the caricature of the slant eyes and the bucktooth person,
Right.
and they were out there picketing and doing those kinds of things, And so they didn't care what, you didn't have to be Japanese. They were this younger generation,
Mm-hmm.
and that's
And
what
good for
the
them.
beauty of all this,
Right.
Yeah. So I think that's, there are two other pieces that I wanted to just alert you about. So one is this early chronology of the Japanese community of Sacramento Valley, which I've found in Dad's computer was drafted by him in 2013. So it's 17 months before he died.
Well, it's about that time he was bugging me. Somebody has to write this history and all that. And so, and the years kept going by and I wasn't doing anything. And I felt responsible because he came and he told me, you got to do this thing. And I always tell people, oh my gosh, Leo is going to come back to haunt me if this thing doesn't get done.
Right.
So I think this is a really good way of doing it.
Yeah, I think he was committed to this project for a really long time, from let's just say 1971, from the very first conversations. This chronology says how he relinquished the chair of the Japanese Community Center and due to health problems.
Yeah.
Now there's no dates here, but his health. But I think that was in 1988 when he had his first
You ought to
heart
write
attack.
that down, because I that's what I was telling your mom. I can't remember when he had that heart attack.
1988.
88.
Mm-hmm. So 71 to 88 was when he was shepherding this group.
And that's interesting because by then we were already talking about the nursing home, because that I can't remember when that opened, but I remember in the 80s we were talking about that. So.
Yeah.
He didn't get to use it himself.
No. Chewy did.
Yes, he did.
Yeah. I said, but I don't know if I want to use it. Yeah.
Yeah, I came to appreciate some things about my dad as a bridge builder, someone who had a lot of skill to enlist people from really different professions, get them interested, get them excited, help them own the project. And so I think that as a city planner, he was okay with this idea of you get people going, you lead from behind, and then you help people just run with it,
and then
it's no
momentum
longer
builds
yours.
up, and then it just goes on its own.
Yeah.
I think that describes his role well.
Yeah. I found some other things that were in the spirit of what he was doing, and helped me understand sort of his skill as a city planner, by looking at some of his other projects that he was doing concurrently with the JCC, and maybe helps provide some context for that work. So K.W. Lee talks about, interviews him, and says in that very first article that I showed, this one over here, about how Dad started his career in developing housing and improving the neighborhood for Black folk. So I wanted to say a little bit about his work in Del Paso Heights, which I sort of knew about, but didn't know about so much until this week. So Del Paso Heights was a 1,000-acre neighborhood in North Sacramento. And at the time, so this is in 1971 to about 74. So he was doing this at the same time. And this was a neighborhood that was really struggling. It was predominantly Black. It had pretty grim statistics about this whole cover. I think this whole cover, which is multiple pages, I think was written by K.W. Lee. Strangely, I think it's from the Sacramento Bee, but there's no headers here about details of publication, but it's a whole section about Del Paso Heights.
Here. Sacramento Union.
Sacramento
Union?
reprint. Okay, yep. But no date. So this was helpful in understanding what is called the big gap here. And it gives some statistics that help put in perspective what this community was struggling with. So 7,500 inhabitants, 2,500 households, and they were low-income folks, welfare families, unemployment was high, and they had substandard housing. They were struggling with drug abuse, vandalism, and premature births were peaking out at 320% of the county average. So there were health issues, just multiple issues, but a lot of pride and desire to build up the community. And so it was amazing to think of my young father taking on this massive project. And it was he secured money for a multi-million-dollar, grants over, 3-4 years. I think 4 years.
This article is, what year is it?
I cross-referenced this. This is exactly the same article as this one. So this whole multiple layout piece does not have a date, but this text is dated, which is exactly the same, is dated March 17th, 1973.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you know what? I was in public health from 60 to 63. I remember my friend who had Del Paso Heights,
Right.
Yeah, the Heights, yeah.
Right.
One quote that really struck me that about his belief in bringing people together, he's quoted here in saying, one thing I'm impressed with is this: if people really get together and do make it happen, things can happen. And so he's got this passion for and a belief in the community working together and what's possible. And I think that he saw change happen here. He was working in a community that he was working across race, he was working across class. They were outsiders. He had to build a coalition between the government people who were predominantly white with this predominantly Black community. And he was able to make inroads and build trust with people. And he talked about how hard it was. He said it was, quote, obviously hostile in the beginning, year one. Second year was a lot less hostile. And then it started to change. By year 3, people were saying, why didn't you come earlier?
Wow. Yeah.
Now, Mom, you had a memory about Dad working in Del Paso Heights.
Oh, yeah. He often come home without having eaten because he had given up his lunch. And there was a time when he was attacked, trapped, in an alleyway, and he couldn't get out and had to talk his way out. They had come after him, and it was a life-threatening position.
Yeah. I know the area. I had Oak Park when I was working.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
Similar situation.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, well, it would be logical and reasonable why folks would be, very suspicious of an outsider.
Right.
Yeah.
I think maybe it might have been to his advantage that he wasn't white, but still, he was an outsider.
Yeah. So under his leadership, the agency was improving housing. They were putting in lights. They were improving like sewers, really basic kind of living things, and then employing people from the community to do this work. So they were trying to have a kind of multi-pronged approach to solve multiple problems. So the agency actually won an award, and then the agency itself cited Dad for his work on this project. And so I think that, to think about Dad's confidence in working with the JCC at the same time that he was doing this project, he was thinking big. He was accustomed to thinking like, if we could get enough people and there was enough momentum and excitement and people could really see the need, then we can do this. Because he had seen it happen. He had been part of like a project like this where no one in government, very few people in the community could see this until they started doing it and making it happen, and like people gaining hope for what they could do.
I'm starting to get a clearer picture now. And remember I asked you when he had his heart attack, and you said it was 1988? See, to me, in my mind, with JCC, I remember the big first meetings with Leo and everything, but later I don't see him so much. I think he was doing his regular job and getting these grants.
Yes.
But he wasn't really, that's why I thought he had quit earlier. So that's interesting.
He was working behind the scenes.
Behind the scenes.
Yeah, exactly.
See, yeah.
Yeah.
So
that was his style.
Yeah.
Right.
It's so interesting. Like I've learned this week that there's a whole confluence of sort of personal commitment and professional experience that helped him be really effective in the role that he played. So he had the connections with the city and the county. He understood how to get money, how to write grants, and use language in ways that these other people would appreciate and understand and see the value of these kinds of projects, and be with people, community people, hear them out, understand their needs, and do that kind of translation work that was really important as a kind of city planner, and was very helpful in the development of the JCC.
Yeah.
So one more project to look at that was in his files, which was also mentioned in Barbara Firebaugh's historical account, which was the later ACC had done work to help preserve the town of Locke. And so that was one of Dad's projects. So I asked Mom earlier today, how did Dad learn about Locke? I guess being from this area, what Locke is. It's a historic, the oldest historic and only remaining rural Chinatown in the United States. And so this was really interesting. This caught his attention, and he began working. This is a little bit later now. This is in 1976.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So he is working to get grants from the Sacramento County to work for the preservation of Locke.
And they have a museum there. Did he help get that money to start that museum?
I would not be surprised.
Because I know they have a museum. Because
there's a foundation now.
Yeah.
Right.
So I learned earlier today that now he was doing this work in the mid 70s. I mean, they were just trying to. He was trying to address some immediate problems. Vandalism was one, so tourists would come and they would just sort of find it interesting and feel free to help themselves. Or fire was a huge issue, so some of the earliest monies went to just getting fire smoke detectors, and they eventually wanted to bring in a sprinkler system, and I don't know if that happened, but and just trying to give these people dignity. He was, as he's interviewed in these papers, you can see some of those pictures. He was really interested in not just preserving the town for the sake of the town, but asking questions about, like, how do you preserve these people's dignity that are still there? There are not many residents left. The young people are moving out, and how do you preserve a town that whose Chineseness, the population is dwindling, and yet give them some peace and what they're. This is someone's community, and so he didn't want to have like people come from a kind of top down kind of redevelopment kind of ethos, and he was sensitive to that. I think probably having worked with the JCC. This is now later, right?
Yeah. And you know how I remember Locke? We used to go to Locke to the grocery store to get illegal firecrackers. You know, you could go there and you could buy them, you know.
Yes.
This is when I was young. And then the Locke, oh my God, the girls' basketball team, oh my God, they were so good and they were so tough. And we used to hate to have to play with them, you know. So I knew some of those kids from Locke.
Yeah.
I mean, not really well, but, you know, they were our foes, you know.
Yeah. So some of the challenges that Dad faced in this project was trying to preserve this and have this be designated and supported by larger entities before private interests would develop it. And so, because Locke was sold to like a Hong Kong developer, and there were like worries that they would, you know, build a golf course around and like make it very commercial, and it would lose its historic flavor. So this article has a Chinatown that needs Chinese. It's dated in 1978.
Wow.
Talking about the developers coming in, having bought the town for $700,000.
So they bought that whole town for $700,000?
Yes. Now, I learned, I wanted to check, like, okay, well, what's the status now? And evidently in 1990, it was designated as a National Historic Landmark. So and then in 2002, Locke was sold to the Sacramento Housing and Redevelopment Agency. So the very agency that Dad worked for eventually bought Locke. So if you can think of like this huge span of time, at least, you know, when these articles start, which is like 76, and it could have even been a little bit earlier, to 2002 until now, I assume it's still under the protection of the Sacramento Redevelopment Agency.
I didn't know they bought things like that.
Yeah. And it was because of my dad's work. And one of these articles he did a lot of like having to, again, be a bridge builder, show people around, help them understand the historical significance. There's at one point he talks about the importance of these places as memorial and commemorative sites to help people preserve like the memory of the pioneers. And I think that was his vision originally for the JCC, which would be to honor, you know, the Issei pioneers. And so I saw that parallel between his work at the JCC and Locke itself. It's sort of something that he was personally committed to and professionally experienced at.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. You've learned a lot. Just going through all
did.
these things, you get a chance to get to know him. Way other people don't ever get. We think, oh, I wish I got to know my father better or something.
Right.
But that time is. But you have all these articles and his works and things that
Right.
you can get to know him that way.
I did. And there's so many questions I would have wanted to ask, and of course, like I was old enough to remember Locke, too young to remember Del Paso Heights, too young to remember the early days of the JCC, but
Yeah.
I mean, people now would know his work in Old Sacramento by the fact that there is the Delta King, and there's activity around the waterfront. That was his last project. And so to think of to be able to say, he could say, and he never did, according to Mom, oh, I made my contribution to the city. That was my project.
Yeah.
Yeah. But he never did say that.
Yeah. I wish I never had any in-depth kinds of conversations with him. I thought, wow, I sure missed the boat here.
Yeah, I think he was a very practical person who not only had a vision, but really was concerned about practical problems. Whether, housing, caring for the elderly, and the fact at the very beginning, his father had just died. He was raising 2 young children who he wanted to make sure, learn their heritage. I think all those things were a confluence.
When he got his first heart attack, did he continue working?
No.
Is that when he
wasn't
retired?
he wasn't able to go back.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was a massive heart attack.
Okay. And then he had heart damage, right? Because I remember he used to take his naps and...
He only had a third of his heart left.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I don't... I kind of consider it an honor that he even... We never really talked that much, but, he brought this file. It was really small in comparison. It just was a few little articles, and maybe I have misplaced something else that he gave me, but I haven't found anything else. But I thought, well, that he kind of entrusted me with this project to keep this story alive.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I'm glad we're doing this now.
Yeah, I think that early chronology, that draft, is very sketchy. It was like he sat down and was like, I got to do this, and he wrote whatever he could remember. He knew that there were lots of blanks that he needed to be researched, and so it sounded like he sort of handed it to you.
Yeah, but and then it's interesting because I've talked to Barbara Sotkan, and remember that article you have? Mine doesn't have an author. Yours has Barbara Fireball as the author, and then Barbara Sotkan adds something at the end. So you have to give me a copy of that when you get your printer going.
Yeah, so I plan to scan, these documents so that AC has it as part of its archive.
Remember I was asking you, what are you going to do with Leo's papers eventually, and so it's good to think about where you would put those things, because they should be saved someplace,
Probably the logical place would be Sac State with all the
I think so. Their archives,
archives.
But give it some thought,
I also created a kind of compilation of what I was learning about the chronology based on these articles, and put as many citations as I could. So
that's good.
It'll be quicker reference than going through all of
these things,
articles again.
See, that just goes to the kind of job she does and being an educator and all that.
Right.
But that'll help you kind of cross-reference what you're learning from other people and trying to piece together.
Yeah. Because Jean Shiomoto. But she was talking today about, I don't know if you've heard of Aiko Herzig Yoshinaga, or Yoshinaga Herzig. She's the person that found in the National Archives that document that helped to clear Korematsu and those fellows, Jean said it's fascinating. She saw a documentary about how she was able to catalog all these things, and she had her own method, and she was able to keep track of everything. Otherwise, how can you keep track of all these things?
Right,
You know, yeah,
right.
yeah. So it's interesting. I'm learning all these different little things, and I think, well, I don't know what it would do, but there are people that do those kind of things.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. So it's great. Yeah,
You have to find a professional that does that kind of thing.
I know it. Yeah. Well, thank you for so
thank
much
you.
for all this that you did. It helps make things become clearer, you know?
Right.
Do you have anything else that,
I think that's it.
yeah. So don't you feel good that you've told Leo's story? You know?
Well, with the help of Courtney doing
yeah,
all that
yeah,
research,
yeah,
yes.
of course, yeah.
I am.
That's great.
And I thank you for the opportunity, because if you hadn't brought this up, it wouldn't have gotten done.
Well, no, remember I told you Leo's going to haunt me if we don't get this done.
I know, I've heard that more than once.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.